Hi, Pain Geeks. Welcome. This is our December edition. This month, we are talking with expert readers, philosophers, clinicians, researchers, all about their reading process and just trying to get a better understanding and some tips and tricks and maybe some insight into, how to find papers, how to read them, what are the kinds of things that we should be looking for when we are trying to assess a paper and read a paper. Maybe properly is maybe not the right word, but something along those lines. And this conversation, we have philosopher Sabrina Conninx with us, which is actually not her first time on the platform. She has been on Pain Geeks before. That was before I was part of the Pain Geeks team, but that was talking about your paper, Sabrina, called A Multidimensional Phenomenal Space for Pain, Structure, Primitiveness, and Utility. That conversation, also talking about your paper, is on the platform. I was listening to it the other day, and it's just a great conversation between you and Laura. I felt really excited to actually go back and read that paper because I didn't have a chance to read it yet. So that was really great. So that's there for you guys if you actually want to see that discussion as well. And yeah, that's kind of it. I feel really sort of nervous and excited actually to be able to host this conversation with you because I don't do these discussions as much. I'm a little bit more new to it, but I feel almost like a kid in a candy shop getting to talk to a philosopher and a researcher and pick your brain a little bit and hear, what insights you have for us as clinicians trying. Often I feel struggling to sort of understand a lot of these concepts and put these things into our clinical practice and broaden our perspectives as we learn about pain, because it seems like an inevitable journey that the more you learn about pain, the more and more sort of in the weeds you get, and philosophy seems inevitable to me, or at least that's been my experience. So welcome, Sabrina.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me again. It's it's really great being here, invited again, and just having a nice chat. And I think it's every time, also last time when Laura invited me, and also that time, every time I learned so much from this conversation as well, because it makes me reflect on things that I do in parts implicitly, or stuff that I think is isn't that this is the normal way to do it, right? And then I recognize that maybe it's just my way to do things. I really enjoyed it. So I'm happy to be here again. Looking forward to have a nice chat about the topic.
Good. We're happy to have you. So maybe a good thing to do first. I know I was reading your website and your biography a little bit, and I saw you did a master's in philosophy of mind, specializing in philosophy of mind, nature, and religion. And then you went on to do your PhD as well in philosophy. And your PhD thesis, if I'm correct, is called Experiencing Pain, a Scientific Enigma and its Philosophical Solutions.
Yeah, I still think the title is way too bold, but I thought it was maybe very good to go for it.
Oh, it sounds so enticing. I really, really want to read that. But it seems even if I just look at those two things, I can put together in my mind, okay, I can understand why maybe she has gotten into sort of the problem of pain and consciousness and all that stuff, because what I understand is that is kind of what you learn a lot about or research about in philosophy of mind. But what about I will start with this one question, and then maybe you can introduce yourself. My first question is why pain? Why do you study pain, research pain? What is your interest?
That's a pretty good question, and sometimes I ask that myself, because it's I think for a lot of philosophers, it's not like you decide on something really and then you say this is what I'm going to do, but it's more like you get into a certain kind of conversation, then it's just interest and gaps in the literature and stuff where you're someone has to do this, and then you kind of feel motivated to do it in this sense. So often I felt it was more by pure chance that I ended up working on pain. Actually, I first worked a lot on emotions, and emotions are often seen in the literature as being more complex than things like pain, itch, and these kind of things. But when one then looks into the empirical data or the clinical practice, it doesn't seem as if pain is a particularly simple thing. And I think I was interested in the beginning, especially to understand in which way, if we study pain, what this means for other philosophical debates in which pain is often ignored. So in which higher cognitive states like beliefs and desires are much in focus, but things that are at least apparently or at first glance seem so simple are just ignored. It's like they are the easy stuff to explain. So let's look at the fancy things, like how do we explain imagination? And for me, this was like a very interesting thing to then actually do, to challenge a lot of ongoing beliefs about how the mind works, in taking pain as an example. And after that, it kind of became like a self-developing research system that I was like, okay, now I've engaged a lot with the philosophical debate, and I was interested to see like how we can also translate this maybe in other disciplines or start communication with other disciplines about the topic of pain. And I was really lucky to get in contact with people like Laura or Peter Stillwell or Mike Ray. So a lot of people that I'm working with together that allowed me to do that, because you often need another person that helps you to say, this is the literature, this is the state of the art, because it's so overwhelming when you're new to a topic and you try to go into it all by yourself. It's often easier when you have someone who's taking you by the hand a little bit and helping you with that.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's for sure. And that's kind of what we try a little bit at Pain Geeks, is we try to give a little bit of structure to some of the readings to help people get it into the topic of pain, because it is so overwhelming and broad and sometimes quite intimidating. But yeah, when I was listening to the conversation that you had with Laura, I was so surprised to hear you say that philosophers kind of think pain is the easy thing, like this sort of primitive feeling that we just kind of know what it is, everybody has it, and we don't have to think too much about that. I was like, what?
I mean, to be fair, this is like philosophy for over 25 years ago. I think especially like in the last 10 years, there was a big change in that. So there's like now is a really rich philosophy of pain that's really also appreciating complexity. But I think that it really took a while to go there. And I think it also quite similar to clinical practice. It's often still these kind of ideas that many people are now coming to terms, okay, it's complex, but there's still like in the background this long tradition or this historical ideas that have somehow grown into literature, especially those people that don't directly engage with pain, where still things like it's a simple sensation are still slipping in. So there's still work to be done, but I would be fair, I think, to many philosophers who have done great work in the last 10 years who would say, okay, it's not that simple. But we're still not there yet, I think.
Okay, all right. Well, that's good. That's reassuring to hear. But actually, maybe you would like to introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what you do for a living and what you study or research and all that stuff.
Yeah, so I'm a trained philosopher. I also studied a bit of psychology in my bachelor's, which was like a nice way to get a grasp or like a first look into empirical sciences and to understand a bit the basics there. And I did my master's mostly about emotions, but also a little bit about philosophy of physics and biology. And my PhD, I mainly dedicated to pain. And now I'm a postdoctoral researcher in a research training group on situated cognition at the Ruhr University in Bochum. And this is an interdisciplinary research group, including psychologists, linguists, primatologists, neuroscientists. So it's very nice to also have this in my research group at the Ruhr University itself, to be allowed to work in an interdisciplinary manner. And I primarily work still on pain, I would say, though at the beginning, I rather focused on typical philosophical problems, and now trying to reach a bit more out, but also to connect the discussions on pain with discussions, for example, on itch or on human suffering or on psychopathological disorders such as depression, for example. And to also work a little bit more on situated concepts of affectivity. So terms like niche constructions, scaffolding, extendedness, these are often terms that are used, but still from a conceptual perspective, it's not always entirely clear what they actually mean when they apply, where they can be useful. So there's still this kind of conceptual work in the background that I'm trying to do as well.
Okay, interesting. So that sounds like a lot of work around, I guess, how we integrate the environment into our experiences, and then how that sort of maybe flows back out into how we act upon the environment. Is it that sort of that relationship between those two things?
Yeah, exactly. No, that's a great description. It's a lot about the question how we use the environment, and then there's on the one hand debates that are for philosophers of much interest, for example, whether these kind of things are actually constitutive parts or are they causal parts. I'm often more interested in also understanding how we can develop, for example, taxonomies of these kinds of things. So how can we say whether something is really rather used by us or whether the environment is used to shape our minds by third parties, for example, which also has to do with a typical debate in this area is, for instance, about social media and internet and how certain platforms are created to shape the minds for the profit of others, as one example. But I'm also interested in question of how we sometimes unintentionally create environments for us that are actually not helpful, so that are rather harmful for us, and that in a lot of conditions, maybe this also applies to chronic pain or, for example, psychopathologies, we actually contribute to our conditions in the same way as society is contributing to it. And to better understand these kind of dynamics, so it's not about normative in the sense of blaming people, but to better understand the mechanisms of, like you said, how this ongoing process is like we shape our environment, the environment shapes us, and how these kind of things go together.
Yeah, right. So that you can kind of pick up maybe on points of intervention where you can sort of shift something a little bit and see how that affects the whole sort of system, the dynamic processes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's super interesting. I think that could be a whole other conversation we could go into, but we're going to stick to the topic now. So I guess as a philosopher, you must do a ton of reading. It's part of your job, right? You're like a professional reader. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
At least in the sense I'm paid for it, if you say, yeah. No, I have a research position. So this means that I'm mostly paid for doing research. So I also do, of course, organization, a bit of teaching and administration. But the main part of what my job description entails is research. And definitely reading is a huge part of research. I don't think that I could say like this percentage of my research is reading, because I think it's a very periodic thing. So when I start a new project, I do tons of reading. I think like with my PhD, the first entire year was just reading, organizing the literature, getting a grasp on what is the state of the art, who's working on what. So also to put authors a bit into the boxes, like, oh, you argue for that, those people react to them and say the opposite. And I think after that, it's then normally boils down. So I'm reducing the literature. I know, okay, this is going to the core things that I'm going to need for this particular paper or to write this particular chapter. And then there's an episode in which I maybe check for quotes, but the rest is just my own development. So the development of my own ideas, writing them down, discussing them with people and so on. And then this cycle starts over again. So I think it's not like a continuous reading. It's more like sometimes I just finish 5 books in a month, and then there's like months where I don't read a single paper, I guess.
Okay, so you don't necessarily have like a structure of how you build it into your life in a sort of regular way, or do you maybe in those heavy periods of reading, do you have like a structure around how you go about reading? Like maybe this question of like, how do you prepare your environment when you want to sit down and read something? Do you have a little bit of like a ritual around that?
It really depends. I think when I'm at home, so I'm working at home, then I normally try not to work at my laptop or my normal desk. So in summer, I always work on the balcony, or in winter, I have a chair in front of the heater, as I have also a really cold apartment. So it's like, there's other typical places, but at least sitting somewhere else is often helpful. But I mostly do this when I read books. And when I read papers, I think I still often just sit at my desk. And I read a lot on the train because I commute to work. So I sometimes spend 3 to 4 hours a day in trains. So I read a lot in trains, which I'm very good at. So I bought myself noise cancelling earphones. Then I always listen to like, I don't know, smooth
Yeah.
music and just read, which works perfectly fine for me.
Oh, that's great.
So I'm more of I read wherever I have time and space to.
Okay. And are you like a paper person or like an e-reader person, or you have a preference for those things?
So I recognize for myself, I'm better in reading when I have them in printed, but with a lot of papers, and this is more in the explorative phase, I often just scan through them. So I often just start and like I read the abstract and then I read the discussion. And then it's like, I then decide, is this something that I want to engage more with or not?
Ah,
And then I don't print them. I just do this all online because it would be, I think, a waste of paper to actually do that. But
sure.
especially books, I really love having books. And if you read, like if you're really engaged with one author, then I also have, like, I kind of get a feeling for where the important parts are in the book. So I don't have to look at the pages, but you roughly know, like in the first third where I made a little note on the right top or something of this kind, then they really become like how I interact with this book, like the things I underline, the stuff I write in there. This really becomes a useful tool for me to actually facilitate engaging with this book. And then of course, I think ebooks I just buy online. So just buy as ebooks normally these handbooks because they are like thousands of pages long and like incredibly expensive, and then it's just way easier to have them as an e-reader, especially as like as my PhD spent time abroad, then you can't bring your books, so you just have to bring your e-reader or the stuff that's on your laptop. So yeah, but I just really love to have books. I have a lot of books.
Oh, I can imagine. I can imagine. I mean, I do too. I just love it too. There's just something so special about just holding a book and, fingering through the pages and yeah, kind of just getting situated with it. Actually, maybe a little bit like getting into the experience of that. And it does feel a bit different on an e-reader or an audiobook or anything else. Although I do enjoy audiobooks quite a bit.
I really like it for like leisure time things, but actually for my research, I can't do that because I don't know, I have to read stuff over and over again. But I know that a lot of my colleagues started to do this as well because it allows also to like do it when you're on the tram or when you're cooking and these kind of things.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so, okay, how do you decide what you're going to read?
I think when I start with my exploratory phase, maybe there I typically start with that's very philosophy. I think that is something that you learn in your first semester in bachelor. There is the famous Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy. It's like a Wikipedia page for philosophers, but it's actually written by proper philosophers. So it's not, so all the articles are in this sense invited and you could quote them. So they are legit resources. And normally there's, for every big topic, there's one entry and they are also updated. So it's a really useful starting point normally because this is like, they give a historical overview. They say like, these are the main positions that are the main defenders. These are typical objections. So it's not always like up to date to the most recent, but if you really want to work yourself into a new topic, they give a long list of references. It's a useful starting point to get a grasp on like what is going on there. Then there's the Philosophy Compass. So that's a journal that's just publishing review articles of debates. They kind of do the same. So they give you an idea of like, what is the current state of the art in this particular area of research. So these are normally my starting points if I don't have any idea about, so to say, what the topic in general is about. There's also then, otherwise I would look for handbooks. So these are mostly collections of the most prominent authors in a debate. And many of the articles there are also rather written in a manner that are introductory. So not that they are like super simple necessarily, but at least they are not like, oh, this is just an article about one argument, but they often try to rather be more reader friendly in this sense. So, I mean, they are the Oxford Handbook of, for example, situated or 4E cognition, for example, or situated cognition or philosophy of emotions. There's also a really huge one. It's called the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Pain. It's massive. And I think at least the philosophers that are the most famous in the last 10 years who worked on pain are all in there, and neuroscientists, the most famous neuroscientists, I would say, but also people from religious studies, from ethics. So these kind of things are often also a very good starting point. And I mean, if you then see who they quote, you get kind of a feeling for who are the people or the milestone papers that have to be read. And typically from there on, I try to find out what's now then, so to say, to like the boiling this down process to see what kind of argument do I want to make and who's then the most important person for that. And then, of course, sometimes it makes sense to check whether there's more recent publications on that, because, of course, these handbooks, they take time. They often represent the state of the art of like 3 years ago, which is still recent, but I mean, it makes sense to what has happened between this in the last time, so to say. And then I just normally scan for keywords.
Okay, that's a good process. And what was the name of the first thing you said that was like the encyclopedia?
Yeah, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Okay.
I think it started as a project from the Stanford University, but I think it's like the first thing that I say to every philosophy student: go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy,
Yes.
check for the different things. It's they also have a very I think the entry was written by Murad Aididi on pain. I think it gives at least a nice, I don't know if it has been updated because it's already there for a couple of years. Like it gives a nice idea at least about the full concept of pain and what kind of typical philosophical problems come with how we understand pain in philosophy, so in a philosophy context.
Okay. Oh, that's so great. Like I am going to look at all of these immediately when we get off the phone. And I'm going to also link these down below for everybody who's listening so that they can also go and check them out. I'm sort of skipping all around on these questions now. I'm sorry if you wanted like an order, but it's just what kind of comes to mind because, yeah, this is really great advice, I think, for someone like me, you know, like a clinician who doesn't really have any educational background in philosophy and is really interested in the topic of pain and really wants to sort of get into understanding sort of the philosophical frameworks in the background and what the different perspectives are, and trying to, you know, build sort of a structure or a framework in my mind. But I know for me, and I think for other people as well, philosophy can seem very overwhelming and intimidating. So it's nice to have a little bit of an orientation now to where you can go and sort of check things out. But like, what kind of advice would you give someone like me, a clinician interested in pain, who wants to start reading more philosophy but feels very overwhelmed by it?
Yeah, so I kind of understand why philosophy, I just came to recognize this because for me, always like, I haven't done anything else than studying 10 years of philosophy. I'm always like, why do people even need us? It's all that simple. And then we are often like, oh, these people use fMRI and they know how statistics work. Like I think this is like, we are equally overwhelmed or like impressed by what I think this is kind of this just feeling, you don't know how this works, you haven't studied this, and then you think like, this must be so complex. So I think like, oh, these people really engage with proper other real humans instead of me just sitting at my desk. So I guess I just want to like reflect this. This is a mutual feeling. That's why these kind of discussions I think are so important. I think that on the one hand, it's important to see not all philosophical things are going to be of interest for you. I think it might depend on what you expect the philosophy to do for you. Because of course, philosophy is a super huge broad area, and there are discussions in ethics where, for example, I don't work at all, that might be of interest for many people to understand what might be the ethics of psychiatry, of physiology, of clinical practice, and these kind of things. Then there might be other philosophical areas which are a lot about, for example, how the full concept of pain works. This might be of interest for some. Others might be more interested in understanding what philosophers have to say about the biological function of pain. And others might be interested in where philosophers really engage with clinical practice and try to apply these kind of things. So I think one shouldn't expect that there's no the philosophy of pain, so to say. I think it's first philosophy there serves many different purposes, and as a meta science, so to say, philosophy always connects to many other disciplines, and so it's pretty diverse, and it shouldn't be like there's no common sense in philosophy on certain kind of things, I guess, at least so far. I mean, I think most philosophers would already say maybe the only common sense for most of them is that pain is a sensation or a subjective experience, but even that is not commonly accepted. So at the second thing, I guess if one has the feeling of being overwhelmed, it might just make sense to engage with philosophers. That's also like, if I have a topic that I don't properly understand or I struggle with something, then the easiest way for me to get around is often to have a chat with my colleagues or with people who are in these debates, because it makes it way easier, or to listen to a talk of them, because reading yourself through a couple of papers that are often not written for introduction, but written to like contribute to an already existing debate can be quite difficult, even for me, if I enter another philosophical realm, so to say, in which I'm not familiar. And again, there, I think it's like to rather listen to talks or like look at this introductory or review papers, or really like chat with these people. I think a third advice might be, even, and this is the same for me, I sometimes read a paper, I don't understand it, or maybe I think I understand it, but it's actually not properly the case. And then I read other stuff relying for that, and I come back to this paper. And I think often you will then read this paper from a completely different perspective. So your background knowledge, the mindset, the stuff that one understands, has changed and allows them to better understand this kind of text. So I think it makes sense to read things even if one not fully understands it, because there's like this cumulative effect that if you read a couple of papers going in a certain direction, you might in the end come up and actually understand what they are about. And maybe you have to do like another tour, like reading it again, but it might still be helpful. And I think it's also fair to say that for us philosophers, certain kind of technical terms are really important. And this has, like, for us, good reasons, because they have a certain conceptual clarity to them, or because we can, like, this typical thing of like, for us, it's really important whether something is like a cause or a constitutive part in these kind of things. But they are maybe not of so much interest to people outside of philosophy. So it's also fair to say, I have a certain perspective and I want to use these philosophy discussions for me. This doesn't mean that I fully have to understand everything that's going on there, or that I have to have the same interest as these philosophers, because most likely there will not be, like, this will not be the same interest. It's just as it is.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, like just to also, because it sounds like also like just kind of relax a little bit, right? Like read things and don't take it too seriously maybe at first, kind of just let it sort of sink in a little bit, and then let it be there. And, because what I experience a lot with reading is I might read something that just is really sort of above my level of knowledge at the moment. But the point of it also is that it entices me, or it sort of motivates me to go, okay, what am I missing here, right? Why don't I understand this? Probably I don't understand these concepts, or I don't see the bigger framework or picture that it fits into. So what do I need to now kind of retroactively do to understand a little bit more what this is trying to tell me? And I think that's really important advice, because we're not always students in a classroom with a teacher laying out a framework for us and telling us the order of things that we're supposed to read and why and what they mean and how they connect to each other. So unfortunately, we don't all have that. So we really have to sort of embrace our own inner teacher in a way, I think, to sort of help us sort of build sort of those concepts in our mind.
Yeah, so sometimes what can also be useful, especially when there's like when one doesn't know how to read any of these kind of things. Sometimes, at least for certain topics, there's also, like, from master courses, they have their syllabus online. So if you see at a certain university, they are teaching a course, I don't know, about pain, you don't have to go there, but maybe have a look at their literature, like what are they about to read, for example.
Right.
Also like from online courses or something. They might just put up like what they read one after the other. I have this, for example, for emotions. If someone would ask me like, what is typical stuff for emotions to read? And there's like this typical thing that you always read first with your students, because they have to understand that to understand the next steps and so on. And I think sometimes for teachers at university, it's pretty easy to see that, but for an external person, it's not, because they, like you said, like you're just starting and you're like, how should one structure that? So maybe it's that, but also to like I said, to maybe have a look at like how introductory books are structured. You don't have to read the entire introductory book, but often they are structured in a way that already explains a bit what to read first and what to read next.
Right. That makes sense. So use sort of like the existing skeletons, the existing frameworks to just kind of get an idea where, you need to kind of be categorizing things a little bit. Yeah. Oh, that's very good advice. I'm not the most structured person, so I really think these things are super helpful. So thank you. Okay. So what do you do when you don't understand something? What is your process for that?
Yeah, so I think first I always use a translator to see if I know the German. So if it's about a word, when it's about words, so not being a native speaker, I still often need translating machines to tell me what the German translation will be for it. But often, I mean, it's more that you don't get a concept or like a broader context in which things are, or a certain argument. I mean, then it's more tricky. No machine is going to tell you why the argument is critical, or why this is actually an objection to something. So in my experience, on the one hand, there's like to read something, a review about this, for example. So if there's a book, and then there's sometimes review articles written about this book, for example, it's sometimes helpful because these people then rephrase what's in the book and often give a descriptive outline and then provide objections themselves. So sometimes it's just the phrasing, or it's just like, I have this as well. There are certain authors, so I think they are brilliant. The way my mind works doesn't fit how they write papers. So my mind works and just, I don't get it out of, but if I then read kind of the same thing, just written by a different author, and they used a different way of structuring it, just makes it often way easier for me to then get a grasp on it. So sometimes I just make this accumulative reading again, then I just like, okay, these authors have written about this, or I know there's a summary of this argument somewhere else, to then look at that. And otherwise, I really think it's about communication with other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that the other person has an answer, but just do like this. What do you think about the paper? What do I think about the paper? And then sometimes we are smarter together than on our own. That people in like bringing together, and someone saying like, oh no, but have you read this footnote? And then it's like, oh, I haven't. And then it's kind of, so I often have like, even if like there are two people who haven't understand it, it's still sometimes helpful to exchange about these things. And it takes a bit of time sometimes, and to make this thing in. And I work a lot with mind maps, because my mind works in a very structured way. So I need premises, and I need conclusions, and I need point one that leads to point two, and so on. So I think my entire apartment sometimes look like I'm I don't know, conspiracy theorist. So like, sometimes written, and then there's a red line to something else, and then there's a red line to something.
Notes everywhere.
Yeah, it's kind of a bit like that. And
or like you're plotting a murder or something.
And it's definitely, as you said, like, be more relaxed about this. Nobody understands everything at first reading. I mean, I think that a lot of the things that I thought to understand in my bachelor's, if I now teach this stuff myself, I'm like, finally, I understand how it works 10 years later. So,
oh, that's funny. That's very reassuring. Definitely. And I really, I agree with your point also about just the process of, discussion is so valuable. And because there's so many times, whether you read something or you hear something and it sort of makes sense in your mind, but then as soon as you have to say it out loud to somebody else, or you just hear their perspective on it, you're like, whoa, I never in a million years would have thought of that. Or actually, I don't know this as well as I thought I did. And you sort of, your mind can kind of play tricks on you in that way. So it's really good to have feedback and like, you know, other people to kind of keep you in check a little bit and to help you also expand outside of your own, you know, little biases or mannerisms of thinking also.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's why, like, I really like giving presentations, because presentations often are just 20 minutes, like on a conference, and they force you to make it structured in terms of like a PowerPoint presentation or something of this kind.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes you to make it appear simple in the sense that the audience is often not familiar with the topic. So you have to explain your work in a roughly understandable manner in 20 minutes. And I think this is the actual challenge. If you manage to write something in, like, I don't know, a 40-page paper, and then also break it down to this 20 minutes presentation and to make it understandable and still like valid, so to still show like the argument works. This is then the actual difference where I think people come to, like, have I really understood this, or just used words to wobble around my own lack of understanding or knowledge and these kind of things.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Okay, and so let me think for a second. Well, okay, what do you think? So why do you think philosophy is important for clinicians? For people like working in pain, who are working with people and treating them?
Yeah, I think this is the very good question. And I don't think that I have like a proper answer yet, because I guess this is kind of what I try to find out myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think when I started with philosophy and the debates I was engaging in, I often had the feeling of like, these are two completely separate things. So the philosophers do their thing and clinicians do their thing. So no connections between them. And then I kind of at least started more to include data from clinical research into the development of the philosophical theory. So the one-way route, so to say, from clinics to philosophy, to say, okay, when I have a philosophical theory, and for example, one prominent theory for a couple of years was that pain has an attention content and pain shows tissue damage. This theory should at least hold with respect to the data we have. And if we look at the data, this kind of gets into trouble, right? So either we need to modulate our theory or whatever, but we cannot just make things up in the sense, and I mean, not saying that these philosophers did that, we cannot make things up that didn't hold to empirical reality, or what we know, what we think reality is based on our empirical data. So I was more working in this direction, saying, okay, if I have a philosophical model, I at least want to have it to check it, so to say, always with reality or our best scientific theory. But then after my PhD, I was kind of like meeting Peter Stilwell. He was on a conference in Germany, and he comes more from the clinical side. And he was like, philosophy is so helpful. I think he was the person who was saying, like, philosophy can be so helpful for clinical practice. And I was like, what are you talking about? And then as I then started to like engage with his work, and we had a lot of different discussions, I was actually thinking like, yeah, maybe it is. And I think I was actually surprised, and we kind of wrote a couple of things, or still writing a couple of things about, it's a bit about the questions like, what kind of philosophical assumptions are actually in clinical practice? And I always at the beginning also had this idea, clinical practice is to a certain degree theory-free, or it seems as if it's theory-free on the surface, in the sense of like philosophical theories, for example, of how mind and matter relate. Of course, there also exist clinical theories, but in the sense of like deep philosophical assumptions that are included there. But it's interesting to see that they actually are, but they are not that obvious. Like in a philosophy paper, the philosopher will tell you, this is my assumptions about the structure of the world, or about what consciousness is. While I have the feeling that in clinical practice, these things are also there, but they're often implicit. And that's because they are also maybe, as at least if, what I've learned, that they are not explicitly taught in a lot of programs. So what we have been trying to do is a little bit to find out what the philosophy of pain is that clinical researchers have, while there might also be not one, but of course there's a variety and there might be, but maybe one can identify like a general bias. And make these things more explicit, and then ask whether this is the adequate way to have. So what kind of philosophical arguments would speak against having these kinds of assumptions, and also which kind of practical aspects would speak against them, because of course there might be philosophical problems with these kind of commitments that one might have implicitly, but also of course from a clinical side there are. And I thought this was like a really amazing learning process for me, just through the conversation with clinicians, to actually learn that they have a philosophy and to learn that it's quite different from the philosophers, so from an academic philosophy, so to say. And I think just starting these dialogues, that was for me the most interesting thing, where I learned and where I think that maybe philosophers can contribute to say, like, look, in philosophy we already, like, there exists a debate about exactly this point, and maybe we can see how this might be important here, but of course taking into account that this has a practical consequence for patients, for how clinicians understand themselves, which is, I think, sometimes that some philosophers have tried to already work on. So I can just really recommend, for instance, the work of Jennifer Corns, who does really interesting thing. Though I often, not often, but in some points I disagree with her. I think that she was really the one who motivated me to think about what does our philosophy actually mean for treatment, and to then get into contact with clinicians, where I think in the clinical research, like people like Peter, for example, I would surely consider them philosophers as well. I mean, they have read so much, they work so much on theoretical aspects as well. I would say that there's just a thin borderline between clinical researchers and philosophers.
Yeah, I agree. I think what you said also about sort of like it's more implicit in the clinic. I was reading also one of your more recent blogs that you wrote with Peter. I think it was still in the draft, but I wrote down this one sentence, and it was like you said, our hidden philosophical beliefs or assumptions about our mind and bodies are exposed when we think about pain and its treatments. And later on, you also said that these beliefs can also be transmitted to our patients, whether we are sort of aware of it or not. And I think that is so relevant, and that I think that is happening all the time. And it exactly what you say, we're not getting taught to sort of think about these things or be aware of these things in school when we are training to be physios, and probably also osteos or chiros. I can imagine it's sort of similar. And so we just kind of, it almost feels like we're just sort of unaware, sort of fumbling around, like just projecting our beliefs on people without even knowing it. And sometimes that can be really damaging. And, you know, what kind of advice would you give for clinicians who are like, how can we kind of make our implicit things more explicit? How can we go about that process of better understanding what our biases and assumptions are?
So I have the feeling that, and this is really just like from an outer perspective, because I think I always still have to say that, like, I'm like not a clinical practitioner myself, so I can just say here a lot of things from this perspective of someone who's allowed to engage a bit with the community in a certain way. But there I have the feeling that, of course, this is a certain bubble, but I was allowed to engage in formats like Pain Geek, but also like different kind of podcasts, where there are more, I have the feeling, more and more people, not so much from the institutional perspective. So it's not that people who are running these schools are inviting and like in saying like we have to renew our way of teaching people, but a lot of people who are in the professions themselves and who are frustrated, I think, to a certain degree with how the situation is, but therefore started communication, and that there are a lot of different opportunities that are coming more and more up, like podcasts, like platforms, like blogs, where people are trying to challenge themselves, their own profession. And I think you don't have to agree with all these people. I think you can also say like, no, we don't have to renew everything. There are certain things that are very valuable. So I think it's not that this idea like progress is always good, but in the sense of like allowing other people to challenge what you're doing, and to start conversations, especially with those that are perhaps not in your line of thinking. This always helps, even if you in the end say they are all wrong. you might still learn something from it, because at least you had you get an idea of like what these other people might think about your profession or the ideas and I don't know, the tradition in which you're working, and what typical objections to this are, and that you have to learn to defend at least your beliefs you have, and therefore you first have to make them explicit. Then you need an evidence or an argument for why you think they are valid or why they are worth being defended. And then you've already done this step, and maybe you come to the point where you say like, oh, the other people, they don't have good arguments, or you come to the point where you say, I think my position is in general right, but we need modification. So maybe also just restrict to think like, maybe this is just works for chronic pain patients of a certain kind. So to also be aware of the limitations of what you're on doing, or where your theory applies to, or you really have to throw all over like baby and bathwater thingy, to throw all away at the same time. So I think for us as philosophers, it's horrible to say that we've been wrong. Nobody likes to be wrong.
No.
But it's not about blaming. It's not about saying like you did something wrong or anything. It's about accepting that maybe there's better ways to do things, better ways to think about something. And it's kind of an ongoing learning process. And it's sometimes it's quite painful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Like, so it's like kind of adopting a stance of like searching. We know we're always sort of searching for what could be optimal or better, and being open to the fact that, maybe what we are doing now is not the best thing, but it's what we're doing because it's the best we have now, maybe, but we can still move on from it if that's necessary, and sort of engaging, maybe being a little bit more active in like a reflection process when we're doing things in clinic, and thinking, well, why am I doing this? And what do I think it's doing? And what does the literature say it's doing? And do those things, go together or not? And if there's maybe some sort of gap or discrepancy, to dig a little deeper, or to find another thing that maybe is more cohesive with that, something like that.
Yeah, and I think, pain research, and if you compare this to other lines of research that we have, is not that old yet. Meltzer and Wall, that's not so long ago since they kind of revolutionized thinking about pain in the first place. So it would be weird to assume that right now we have already found the best available model in a sense of a God's eye view. Is this the end point? Most likely it's not.
Mm-mm.
And also the kind of idea that we're gonna find a magic bullet is most likely not going to happen. In medicine in general, we don't find magic bullets for most conditions. Maybe our vaccine and antibiotics might be the really rare exceptions. So most likely we're gonna need like a toolbox of a lot of different things that we combine, where we need to learn to be flexible, to work with the uncertainty that things are not going to work out at first trial, and also to kind of accept that, to be suspicious about everyone who tells us that they found a universal cure for whatever. That's most likely not going to. We at least have good reason to be suspicious about these kind of things.
Yes. I definitely agree with that. And I think we do get led on a little bit, like in our schooling as physio, because we do get sort of, we do get kind of led on to this idea that, these are the answers and this is what works for this. And there's not really, so at least in my experience, there's not so much discussion around the uncertainty and the grayness. So it's not really encouraged. So I think also it is a big painful struggle for a lot of people afterwards to sort of come up against that realization that, okay, we don't actually know what's going on here. And it would be a lot easier, I think, if that was sort of nurtured and encouraged more in school, in the professional development, instead of having to sort of figure it out on your own. And it sort of lands on you like a pile of bricks, and then very existential crisis-y, and sort of sad.
But at the same time, because of course it's also like it's a balancing act. Even if we accept things are complex, we might kind of have to make them manageable. We are not supercomputers where you just like they are able to process this entire information and then come out with full. I mean, we have to learn to how to handle things in their complexity. And I think that this is definitely still where I'm often struggling with when people are we're presenting our theories or our ideas. So Peter and I, and then people say like, "But how do I do this then in my practice?" And this is like, that's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think maybe also the allure of like the philosophers also, you're like, they know, they have the answers, give us the answers. But yeah, we're all just trying our best to understand what's going on. But I'm going to ask you one more question.
Yes.
And then we're going to go because I have taken your time too much already. But what do you read for fun?
Yeah, I thought about this actually because as a teenager, I just read like so much, and since then, reading became my job. I just read in summer holiday and in winter holidays. So I have 2 episodes of the year in which I read, and then I read like 2 books a week or something, because this is like, I know it's the only time that I have really like I'm in the mindset of doing leisure time reading.
Yeah.
But then I just recognized like everything I read in the last year is just like typical fantasy stuff, like Lord of the Ring, Rivers of London, Game of Thrones, I don't know, Hitchhiker Through the Galaxy, Harry Potter, all these kind of stuff. I just like,
cool.
I think it's a lot of fantasy, and especially like I think in the last year I worked myself through all Terry Pratchett books, which I really love as well. And sometimes I feel encouraged to slip in some critical feminist stuff, like Egalia's Daughters or the Gift. I think they were like really awesome books.
Okay.
But besides that, yeah, it's mostly fantasy stuff that brings you into another world.
I totally understand. I'm reading, actually, I have right here, I'm reading like an Ursula K. Le Guin book. Do you know her as an author?
Oh, no, I don't know her.
Oh, she's really good. It's just like science fiction, fantasy, and it's always about being in another planet and like almost like an anthropological perspective of what this other world is like. And I love that kind of stuff too. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I think when I was younger, I read a lot of crime, but I think especially since I worked so much on pain and suffering, it's like I want this joyful hobbits going on a journey stuff for my free time.
That makes sense. Yeah. We need to have some pleasure too in our lives.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Sabrina, for taking time and sharing with us all of your wisdom and knowledge and thoughts on how we can all add a little bit more philosophy into our lives. And I just want to say, yeah, thank you. And I really hope that you will come back onto Pain Geeks and keep talking to us and sharing with us. And I hope you have a really wonderful holiday.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me again. It's always like, it's a great pleasure, and wish you all a good holiday season as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Enjoy your day.